Okay, we're here in book 3, and if you have been following along, now you will know who the little boy is that's on here. This is actually Samuel that's on here, on the front of the book. So that's what I think it is anyway. So we're in part 4, story 5, choosing a king. What would you do if you were asked to find someone to be king? Where would you look for him? What kind of person would he be? This was Samuel's problem. The elders of Israel had said, "Give us a king." Now it was up to him to find one. No doubt he thought of all the fine men he had met on his travels through the country. There were there was that big, strapping fellow that he had met in a meeting at Gilgal, but no, he wasn't good enough. There was that nice-looking lad in a home he visited in Bethel, but he wasn't strong enough. Yet somewhere there must be a young man who would be just right for the job. But who is he? Who was he? And where? Then one day God told Samuel that he wouldn't have to go searching anymore. A young man was on his way to him that would arrive in the city the next morning. "Tomorrow about this time," he said, "I will send thee a man out of the land of Benjamin, and thou shalt anoint him to be captain over my people Israel." The next morning Samuel went to the city gate and watched everybody that came in. As the people streamed by him, wondering whether this man or was the right one, or that was the right one. Once one of them would be the first king of Israel, but which one would he be? Then his eyes rested upon one of the finest young men he had ever seen, and young man, a choice young man, and godly, tall, handsome, and powerfully built. He stood out among the crowd as if born to be a leader. As this splendid youth, standing head and shoulders above everyone else, came toward Samuel, God said to the prophet, "Behold the man." In other words, he was real tall. "Behold the man." Pause. "This same shall reign over my people." Of course, the young man, whose name was Saul, didn't know anything about this. In fact, he had never seen Samuel before. For the past 3 days, he had been searching for his father's lost donkeys. It doesn't say donkeys. And those donkeys were all that concerned him at the moment. His servants had struggled to that maybe the seer suggested that maybe the seer, that's why they called him a prophet. He didn't call him a prophet, he called him a seer. And then here's a picture of somebody of said, how he was much taller. Saul was much taller than everybody else. His servants had suggested that maybe the seer who lived in the city could tell where the donkeys, it doesn't say donkeys, could be found. And that's why he came. Is the seer here? He asked. I am the seer, said Samuel. And don't worry about there's that word again, donkeys that were lost 3 days ago. They have been found. How does he know about my father's donkeys? Keep saying that word. Wondered Saul. How could he possibly have heard that they had been found? For, of course, there was no telegraph or telephone in those days. Then Samuel invited Saul and his servants to dine in his house. When they were shown to the parlor, he found out when they were shown into the parlor, they found about 30 people there. And you can imagine Saul's surprise when he and his servants were given the most honored seat. He was still more surprised when Samuel told his cook to bring the special portion of food that he had reserved for this occasion and set it before him. Everybody in the room must have wondered why the stranger was treated so well. Perhaps some thought it was because he had come just come to town, or that he was related to Samuel in some way, or that he was such a big man he needed extra food. Big man. But Samuel never said a word. He just let them think what they pleased. Someday they would find out. That evening Samuel and Saul had a long talk together under the stars on the flat roof of his house. Then they went to bed. The next morning the prophet walked with Saul and his servants to the outskirts of the city to bid them goodbye. There he whispered to Saul, tell your servants to walk ahead of thee, to walk on ahead. The servants obeyed. Then Samuel opened a small bottle of oil he had brought with him and poured it upon Saul's head. After that he kissed him and said he was now anointed to be captain of the Lord's people. Something happened to Saul at that moment. As he turned to go from Samuel, God gave him another heart. That meant that all his thoughts and plans were changed. Up to this moment, he had thought only of himself. Now he began to think about others and what he must do for his people and his God. Samuel told him that when he arrived at Rachel's tomb, he would meet two men who would tell him that his father's donkeys, it doesn't say donkeys, were found. Then in the plain of Tabor, he would meet three men, one carrying 3 kids, one carrying 3 loaves of bread, and the other carrying a bottle of wine. They were to give him 2 loaves of bread. Then when he got to the hill of God, he would meet a company of prophets singing and prophesying, and he would join them. Everything happened exactly as Samuel had said, which helped Saul to believe that everything else the prophet had told. And then got a picture of him getting anointed. Everything else the prophet had told him was equally true. Then, some days later, he went to Mizpah. Thousands of people were gathered there, and Saul guessed that it was time, guessed that this was the time that Samuel would present him as their king. He began to be afraid and hid himself among the baggage. From there, from where he lay, he could hear Samuel speaking to the people, reminding them of all God had done for Israel since he had brought them out of Egypt. Then he cast heard lots being cast to discover the tribe in which the new king would be found. Perhaps the tribe of Judah would be taken, he thought, or maybe the tribe of Simeon. He hoped so, for that would let him out. But no, the tribe of Benjamin was taken, his tribe. Then the lots were cast among the families of Benjamin, when among the members of the family of Kish. Finally his name was called. Saul, Saul, cried his friends, but he didn't answer. The great moment of his life had come, and he was not ready for it. Instead, he was hidden behind a heap of bedding, or maybe a pile of pots and pans, or a bale of hay. And and there was last they found him, led by an exciting group. To Samuel, he turned his face towards the cloud. Face he turned and faced the crowd. Just as the prophet said, see ye him whom ye Lord hath chosen, and there is none like him among all the people. Saul would gladly had run away back to his farm anywhere, but he couldn't. All of a sudden, a great shout went up. God save the king! God save the king! Of course, they still have him called. This is the illustration they got. Get it framed, tilt it. There you go. And that was the end of story 5 and part 4. And we're going to take a break, and then we're going to go to our next one. Have fun. It's getting good. Then we'll be in the next book.